meant as a teaching video for Bach's Prelude to his first cello suite. So Bach wrote 6 cello suites, and this is just the first movement of the first of those suites. It's the most famous of the movements from his cello suites. This is a really incredible piece. It was written for solo cello, no accompaniment whatsoever, but because of the beautiful arpeggios in this piece of music, it really gives the impression of having lots of different voices, even though you're really only hearing one voice. I think it's particularly well suited to the hammered dulcimer because of all those arpeggiated lines. Our instrument keeps ringing, and so you really hear those harmonies coming through, which you don't necessarily get on all instruments. So I think this is a really fantastic piece to play on this instrument. Interestingly, during Bach's lifetime, this was not a well-known piece. It wasn't actually until the 1900s that somebody dug it up and it started getting a lot of attention. And now if you get on YouTube, you can hear all of the great cello masters playing this piece. And do get on YouTube and do some listening to their interpretations. Like many Baroque pieces, this piece of music, we don't have any copy of it that has any sort of correct annotations that Bach made about things like dynamics or articulation, which means that it's really up to everybody who's played this piece to make their own interpretation of this piece of music. We could spend a lot of time trying to figure out what they would have done, most likely in the Baroque era, but I would also point out that we're playing this on a different instrument than it was meant for to begin with, and I think that we're going to find that our interpretations will be different because of the instrument that we're playing on. So don't be afraid, for you as the musician, to make those decisions on what you like in terms of dynamics and tempo. I tend to change the tempo a lot as I play this piece. So this is really a blank slate for you to put your own musical interpretation on, which is, I think, one of the things that makes this piece really exciting. Now, I've given 2 arrangements of this piece. One is a solo arrangement, and it's very true to the original cello arrangement. Really, all I've done is change it to an octave that's appropriate and a clef that's appropriate for our instruments, put it in treble clef, and I've changed just a couple notes to make sure that it fits on our 15-14 instruments. I've written in the chord structure just to give you an idea of what it is you're playing, but I also have not put in dynamic and tempo and articulation type markings, again because this really should be your own personal interpretation. I have, though, provided videos, and particularly the solo video that gives an example of how I might shape this piece of music when I'm performing it, just to give you some ideas of what to do. I've also given a duet arrangement, and I said that this was originally an unaccompanied cello piece, and that's true. So this duet arrangement really isn't true to the original form of the piece, but I find it's a lot of fun to play this with somebody else. The chord structure in this, like all of Bach's pieces, is really incredible, what he's done here. And what I've done in the duet arrangement is I've done my best to really highlight those chordal changes and also to think about kind of the ebb and flow of the piece as I interpret it and try to accentuate that. One thing that you should know, in the duet video, I did that with a metronome. And the reason I did that was because I had to play the duet with myself, recorded later, and if I wasn't staying on a tempo, that I really wouldn't be able to keep together on those 2 parts. When you're playing with somebody else live, you'll find that both of you change tempo and change dynamics together, especially if you're listening closely to each other. So please don't feel like you should ever in this piece stay with a metronome. It's a piece that you really can vary that tempo a lot as you're moving through it. What I'd like to do is just go through a few of the spots in the solo version that I find particularly tricky. The solo version is the harder part. Again, there is a duet part. The duet, that second part, is really just an accompaniment to the first part. This will work really well if perhaps you're playing with somebody and you're at 2 different levels. The person that's more advanced might take that first part. If you're playing with somebody and you're both at about the same level, you might consider kind of taking the piece of music and breaking it up so that where you feel there's a natural break in the piece, perhaps you switch parts at that spot in the music so that you both get a chance to play the lead. So just consider that as you're working on it. So this is a long piece. There's a lot of notes. It really moves you around the instrument, perhaps in ways into notes that you're not as used to playing. So it can be a very challenging piece to play and also a very challenging piece to memorize. Now, I don't know about you, but I have never mastered looking at a piece of music while looking at my instrument. I'm just not very good at it. So I tend to be better off memorizing my music. And I think that even if you are fairly used to looking at music and your instrument at the same time, you might also find it easier to memorize. And the reason for that is it really causes you to jump around the instrument a lot. So when you're reaching for those notes that are in weird places, you may have trouble looking at the piece of music. If you do want to memorize this piece, the first thing I would do would be to spend a lot of time listening to it. So you can listen to the videos that I've put up, and you can go again and go hear other people's interpretations of this piece. There's some other great hammered dulcimer players who play it, as well as, you know, great cellists and all sorts of other instruments that have done covers of this piece. So just spend a lot of time listening to it and really getting your ear in and thinking about kind of the natural breaks in the piece of music. Personally, I find that there's about 3 sections in this piece of music, and that's kind of how I approached it. I had a beginning and a middle and an end section that I broke up when I was thinking about memorizing it. So perhaps one day I'd only work on that middle section or only on the end section so that I had a way to really focus in. It's best for you to figure out where you feel those sections are. This is, again, a piece of music that can be very highly interpreted. And that means that if you really want to be able to connect and remember that piece of music, you need to make the sections based on how you connect to the piece of music. So that's why you spend a lot of time with it. Once you get it down into those sections, what I do is start by taking 2 measures at a time. So I'd play the first 2 measures, for example. But then rather than going from doing measure 1 and 2 first and then doing measures 3 and 4, I do overlapping sections. So do measures 1 and 2 together, play them 10 times, then do measures 2 and 3 together, etc. throughout the piece. And once you're comfortable with those pairs of measures, you can go back through and maybe do 3 measures at a time or 4 measures at a time and start to work up to those sections. That overlapping is really important because what tends to happen if you learn just a piece and then the one that comes after it, you often learn to pause in between those 2 sections that you're trying to put together. And when you practice pausing, you become very good at pausing. So it's best to try to minimize that kind of thing when you practice. So be careful with that. So I do want to point out just a few parts of this piece of music that I find challenging. And most of those you'll find are places where there's accidentals. So it'll be easy to see on the piece of music the places that I'm likely to go to. So the first place that I want to point out is measure 11. So if you go to measure 11, it's a G sharp diminished 7th is the chord in the solo arrangement. And take a look at that. The way that I played this, I should also mention I'm right-handed, so I tend to approach things as a right-hand lead as much as I can. Now this piece of music is slow enough that having a strong lead hand really is not important to keep the rhythm. You really should only confine yourself to a hammering pattern if it's going to help you with something like keeping the rhythm. And in this case, it's slow enough you really don't need to worry too much about that. But it does mean that I naturally tend to try to go with my right hand first if I have the option. So as you're listening to my hammering patterns, keep that in mind. Now that being said, this piece of music, because it has so many accidentals and moves so much around the instrument, this piece of music forces you to lead with both hands from time to time. So don't be afraid to switch back and forth. If you find you just are in a really awkward hammering pattern or you're missing notes, often think about whether there's a way to play that phrase with a different hammering pattern, starting with the other hand, for example. Also, do not be afraid to play more than 1 note in a row with 1 hand. Again, this does not need to be a fast piece of music, so you have plenty of time to do more than 1 note in a row. So my default as I'm describing these hammering patterns is going to be when I can to start with my right hand, and it's going to be to alternate hands, but again, including this measure, I'm actually going to start with my left hand, and I'm going to do a lot of doubling, doing 2 notes in a row with 1 hammer. These are just suggestions. I tend to think in one way, and you may think very differently. If these hammering patterns don't work for you, fine. There's lots of other correct ways to do this, so don't be afraid to explore. Don't feel like you need to mirror my hammering patterns to play this correctly. So that measure 11 starts in a G sharp, And really the only place you're going to find that G sharp, probably, unless you've got some strange tuning going on, is on the left-hand side of your treble bridge. So you're pretty well confined to playing that there. And I start that with my left hand because that's the convenient hand to grab that G sharp with. Now, the weird thing that I tend to do in this measure that I've found is easiest for me is that I go from that G sharp. So the notes, here's what the measure sounds like. G sharp, and then we need a D and an F natural. So I could play the D on the right hand side of the treble bridge if I wanted, but I'll go all the way down to my bass bridge and I play the D just above my marked course C there. What that does is it gets my right hand in position to easily grab the F natural above it. So I play the G sharp with my left hand on the left hand side of the treble bridge, and then I grab both the D and the F natural with my right hand on the bass bridge. Now I grab the E with my left hand and I put that on the right hand side of the treble bridge because that's just the easiest place for me to get it. And I basically use my left hand to play the notes on the treble bridge and my right hand to play just the D and the F natural on the bass bridge in this measure. On the bass bridge, but anytime I have a D and an F natural, either direction, F natural to D or D to F natural, I do that with two right hands in a row. So that's just an idea of how to approach that measure, one of the early difficult measures in the piece. Another one that you might stumble on is, let's see, measures 19 and 20. Oh yeah, so like I said, this is a piece of music, actually measures 20 and 21, my apologies, measures 20 and 21. This piece of music is written for cello, and it almost completely fits on a 15-14 instrument, but there's one change that I've made in the music. I've just moved a note up an octave to accommodate the size of our instrument, and that's in measures 20 and 21. And what you'll see that I've done there is I've actually written that note in both octaves. The lower octave is the way that it was originally written in terms of where the line goes. It goes down to that lower octave. And you might have that if you have an extended range instrument, so if you do, please play that note. I'm playing on an instrument that doesn't have those notes. I have some extended range here, but I don't have those notes. So I've brought it up an octave, and that's how I've done it in the recording. So you can see that the way it fits on a 15-14 instrument. So all I've done there is I've taken a C sharp and a C natural and moved them up the octave. So when you see that written with two notes together, know that those aren't two notes that you have to play both of them. It's just that the bottom note is the one that was originally written and the top note is the one that I've written to make it fit on this instrument. And honestly, I think it sounds great either way, so that was really convenient in making that work here. All right, so a couple more difficult spots. Measure 22, just be a little bit careful. There's a C natural in the second half of the measure, even though there was a C sharp in the first half of the measure. Usually, if you see this written, if you're looking at a different piece, or different transcription of this piece of music, you often won't see that natural sign in the second half of the measure. That's just because if the C sharp on top in the upper octave is sharp, usually the convention is that doesn't mean that the lower octave is also sharp, so they assume you mean natural. I've just put it in there to remind you, so just know that that's why that's there. It's just an extra reminder that's a C natural, which is what is in the key signature. Measure 24, and actually measure 24 and measure 26 have kind of similar things going on. Again, this is a place where you see a lot of accidentals in the music, so it's a little bit difficult to play here. This has an E flat in it, so there's my E. My E flat is all the way at the top of my bass bridge. It's possible that you may have to tune a note up to get that E flat, depending on how your instrument was originally tuned, so just be aware of that. The way that I play this, again, this is one of those measures where there are a lot of hammering patterns that can work. This hammering pattern might make no sense to you. It makes sense to me though, and so I'm going to show it to you with what I do. So I grab the E flat, up on my bass bridge, because that's the only place I have it in that octave. And the measure, here's what it sounds like. So that's the part that we're focusing on right there, starting at the beginning of measure 24. The way that I like to play it, you'll notice there's some repeated notes. There's 2 Ds in a row there, and 2 Cs in the row. And I just like to play both of those with one hammer. I do it as a double stroke. So I do right hand on the bass bridge on the E flat. That's D, C sharp, D, D, and I do that left, right, left, left. All on the left-hand side of the treble bridge. Then I have to grab a C natural, so that's when I switch to the right-hand side of the treble bridge, and I do a very similar pattern there where I get C, B, C, C, but this time it's right, left, right, right. And that sets me up well to be in a good hammering pattern. Again, it puts me on my right-hand lead at the end of that, which is what I like. So that's the hammering pattern that I like there. It's pretty similar in the next accidental section, which is the second half of measure 26. You'll see a C sharp, and then a B natural, and an A. Remember that those accidentals carry through the measure if they're on the same note. So we have B flat throughout that whole measure, so don't try to go back to a B natural. We do C sharp, B flat, A, and then we have 2 B flats. So again, I like to do that as a double stroke. Right, right. Then we get A, G sharp. And I actually do get my right hand all the way over to the left-hand side of the treble bridge to play that. I just like that. And then we have 2 A's in a row. I like to do that as a double stroke. And the 2 G's in a row as a double stroke. And again, personal preference, there are a lot of hammering patterns in these 2 measures that work well, but that happens to be what I like here. If we get towards the end here, I think one of the most challenging parts of this piece of music is not challenging because of the notes, it's challenging because of trying to keep your spot in the piece of music. And that's especially starting measures 33-ish, 34, where you have a lot of, actually all the way back to 31 even, where you have a lot of drone notes going on. So this is just the second beat of 31. And here we're droning on that A, and I like to do the melody or the moving notes with my right hand, and I keep my left hand droning on that A. And we drone on that A for a long, long time. And that is actually, I mean, if you look at the chords that I've written in, you'll notice that we have like 8 or 9 measures that are just a D chord or a D7 chord. So you're really just hanging on that D chord for a really, 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 really long time. And what that means, so D chords, we're in the key of G. The D chord is the 5 chord. It's the dominant chord in the key of G, and it leads very, very strongly back to the G chord. So by hanging on that D chord for so long, what Bach is doing is building your anticipation. You really want it to lead back to that G chord, and by keeping you in suspense, it makes that final chord just so much sweeter. But that does mean that we hang there for a long time, and he additionally builds the suspense in that section by playing that drone note over and over and over. And it's A most of the time. We switch to droning on D in measure 37. So this is a great place to play with crescendos. I like to kind of crescendo the whole thing, although I do some up and downs in there, rising up until you finally get to the G chord, the resolution in measure 39. This is hard to keep track of where you are in this section. So this is one that I drilled a lot. And for me, there's a couple things you can do here. One is to look for patterns, and in particular look for patterns in the moving notes. Everything Bach does has a pattern. He was very, very logical in all of his music. Personally, I found these patterns a little bit too complex for me to figure out. Okay, we're doing, the moving note goes, for example, oh gosh, I'm not even gonna try. The patterns didn't work for me, to be perfectly honest. What I found worked best for me was to just sit there and drill, again, just the way that I said it at the beginning, do 2 measures at a time, practice those over and over, do the next 2, until it was just second nature for me to get through this. But if that's not working for you, really sit down and map out those moving notes, see what patterns you can identify in there, and that might help you a lot in keeping track of your place in this. The last part that I think is difficult, and I do a hammering pattern that might be a little bit unexpected, is starting in measure 37. So this is where we switch our drone note down to D, and we have a chromatic scale that leads us up to the high G for that really beautiful resolution. This part, what I like to do, so it sounds like this. Drone notes in there, but you get the idea. So that's the chromatic scale that we're dealing with here. This puts you into some weird positions. So what I like to do, this causes me to jump around a lot because I have to find those accidentals. And what that means is that I like to play those accidentals, the chromatic scale part, all with my right hand, because that's my dominant hand. It's the hand I'm most likely to hit notes accurately. It also works pretty well because my right hand can get over to the bass bridge and hit some of those notes that can be hard to reach. So I stick to that in here. I do all alternating hands in these measures. Right hand gets the chromatic scale, left hand stays on that drone D. The reason this is kind of weird, right at the beginning, we get the F natural, the F sharp, the G, and then the G sharp, which is on the left-hand side of the treble bridge. I don't quite cross my hands. I kind of shove my left hand out of the way so that my right hand can get over to that G sharp. You could change hammering patterns there. You could switch leads. You can do 2 notes in a row with one hand. See how that works for you. I found that this was worth it. I very rarely do this kind of crossover thing, crossing my hands or shoving one out of the way, because it just usually isn't worth it. But here I found I was most accurate if I could stay with my dominant hand having that chromatic scale. So that's what I chose to do. Again, I alternate hands the whole time. The right hand gets the chromatic scale because I'm right-handed. My left hand stays on the drone. It leads to some weird crossovers and things, but that's okay. It ended up being the most accurate way for me to play that. So spend some time on your own figuring out what works for you in terms of hammering patterns there. That's really the main things when it comes to the solo arrangement. In terms of the mechanics of doing it, of course, this piece really comes alive when you start adding interpretation to it. And I do that in 2 ways. There's 2 main things that I change throughout this piece of music. One is the dynamics, it's the volume, and the other one is the tempo that I'm playing the notes. So again, I would not recommend doing this with a metronome. I tend to like to speed up and slow down as I feel it in the music. So for example, at the beginning, we have this fairly repetitive pattern. That's pretty boring if you just play it at one volume and at one tempo. I do a lot of changing both the volume and the tempo through here. So here's an example of something you could do with it. Phrases, those 1 measure phrases there, I did a crescendo and then a decrescendo, and I also sped up when I crescendoed and I slowed down when I decrescendoed. That's a really natural thing that your listener will easily go along with, so that's a good way to start when you're thinking about volume changes and tempo changes together, is to think about speeding up when you get louder, slowing down when you get softer. You can always do the opposite, but it's just a good place to start because it's a pretty natural way to start that kind of thing. So again, please do spend some time thinking about the interpretation, trying out different things that you like, different things that you don't like, spend some time practicing just speeding up and slowing down. We're trained to keep a tempo, so it can be hard to start doing that kind of speeding up and slowing down. This is a fantastic piece to do that with, though, just because it is mostly 16th notes. It's mostly even notes throughout, so you don't have to worry about having weird rhythms that you're also trying to speed up and slow down. So have fun with that solo arrangement. The last thing that I just wanted to mention was in the duet arrangement. You'll notice that in a few places in there, I have 3 notes written on top of each other. I only have 2 hands, so I can only play 2 notes at once. And if you're like me, you'll have to find a solution there. What I do there, I don't mean for you to play them all at once. What I mean for you to do is to play them as a rolled chord. So right in that first measure, the first measure goes like this, in the duet part, the accompaniment part. So that last chord there, that's a G, a D, and a G, and I play that as a rolled chord, so 3 notes just very quickly together. If you're not used to playing rolled chords, be careful with this. Even if you are, be careful with this. That line is supposed to really, it's a rising line. It's supposed to bring kind of a lifting feeling to that harmony. And the notes that therefore I want to most emphasize are the notes that are rising. So we keep that G on all 3 notes in the measure. So I don't want to keep emphasizing that. What I want is the notes that are changing. So be careful, because especially when you do that rolled chord, it's really natural to try to accent the bottom note there. And your instrument is naturally louder down low. So you have to be really deliberate about not playing that low note too loudly. Make sure that top note really comes out. Other than that, the duet accompaniment is pretty straightforward. Again, don't play this with a metronome. When you're playing with another person, if you're listening to each other, you will naturally speed up and slow down together with this piece of music. You'll have to practice it, but this really is meant to have some of that feeling put in with tempo changes. So just do a lot of listening to each other in this piece of music. As always, feel free to contact me if you have feedback or questions on all of this, and I really hope that you enjoy the piece as much as I do.